So I'm going to be talking about Herschel Sperling, 1927 to 1989, who survived 2 death camps, 5 other camps, and focus on the mental health of a survivor, based on a book which was published in 2010, this one, Treblinka Survivor, The Life and Death of Herschel Sperling. The book lays out in graphic detail, not normally seen outside psychiatric case notes, his descent into profound depression, which led to his suicide at the age of 62 on the 46th anniversary of his arrival in Treblinka. So I'm going to follow his life from the story, the miraculous survival, to a life where the tortured memories of Treblinka never left him. These memories were first documented. How do I get to the... This picture shows the paper that he wrote for a journal of history of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, published in Yiddish in 1947, and this is the other end of the book, which has the list of contents in English. The author of the biography was the childhood friend of Sperling's younger son. They'd been at school together from an early age, beginning in the Jewish elementary school in Glasgow, and he thought of him first as a slightly cheery but crazy figure with a number tattooed on his arm. And only after Herschel's death, when he began to piece together aspects of Sperling's past, did he realize that this man had been haunted and tormented every day of his life. His older son recalled, even when he was calm, he was disturbed. So I'm going to look through the story of his life, the tragedy of his teenage years, his emotional failure to escape from his past, and examine his and his son's lengthy struggles with psychiatric treatment. He was born in a small town in March 27, not far from Częstochowa, where he was deported to Treblinka in August 1942. He and his family had been hiding there. I don't know. And they were discovered and sent off to Treblinka. And I'm not sure whether he was selected immediately for death, but his story was that just as the people were moving towards the gas chambers, a hand reached out, grabbed him, pulling him to one side, while the rest stumbled onwards to their death. He was one of 30 men out of the thousands in his batch selected to join the slave squads of prisoners who kept the wheels of the gruesome machine turning. He was the only family survivor. He endured brutal, grueling and emotionally draining tasks in the camp, and was one of the few survivors of the final desperate prisoner breakout. His freedom, unfortunately, only lasted a few days. He was soon arrested, but had the good fortune that the 2 SS men who had picked him up had spoken to him in German, in which Herschel was fluent, and he spoke Polish without the trace of a Yiddish accent, and they decided that what they would do would be to put him in with a group of Polish political prisoners who were being sent from Radom to Auschwitz, and we'll go in a little bit about the details of that there. What comes out of Herschel's experiences, and we'll examine this in a little more detail, was that having been part of the death machine in Treblinka and entering Auschwitz as a Polish prisoner, he would tell people in Glasgow, Treblinka was hell on earth, Auschwitz was nothing in comparison. People really couldn't understand him and couldn't understand the difference in his experiences between the 2 places. So this is the German troops entering Częstochowa, And from the book's acknowledgements, the writer said the largest part of debt of gratitude belongs to the sons, because, as we'll see, they were hurt by the memories they were asked to recall, and the book was really a testament to their suffering. And before I get on to the early life, I just want to recall that the last words that Sam, the younger son, said to his father, "You should never have brought us into this world." And Herschel said, "You're right." So quickly, Herschel understood in Treblinka that everybody was going to die, and I've got some pictures here of one or two of the survivors and the images which they created of the camp. You see here this one with a Red Cross flag on the outside, just to make it look as if this is something a bit more normal. And this is the Treblinka Memorial. So he became focused on surviving the murderous hell of Treblinka and the sorting squad, dealing with the emotionally draining task of receiving transports, sorting mountains of clothes, and receiving valuables which fed into the swollen coffers of the SS and local black marketeers. And in later years, he would put his survival down to the help of an older man, Samuel Reisman, who settled in Montreal after the war, who acted as a surrogate father, and also from a bit of luck. Herschel was tormented all his life, and this being forced to process the belongings of those who'd just been killed. So in the memoir that was published in Yiddish, I've got a translation of it here, how he describes what it was like. The smell of blood, the dreadful stench of the decomposing and burnt corpses, wafts death itself over the workers of the death brigade. No one can stomach this work for more than a few weeks. Even the SS units are changed every 2 weeks and sent on immediate leave. Even the murderers themselves cannot bear this diabolical bestiality. By the summer of '43, the extermination of Polish Jewry was coming to an end, and desperate men hid valuables and smuggled weapons, risking death but ready for a revolt. When the rebellion came, the weapons created a diversion, allowing around 1,000 prisoners to escape beyond the boundary of Treblinka, but under machine gun fire. Most were killed or captured, and less than 100 made it to the forest. However, as we've said, he was picked up on his way to Auschwitz, and the archives at Auschwitz confirm that he was recorded as an ethnic Pole on arrival with the letter P against his name and number. He continued to pass himself off as a Polish Christian while still at Auschwitz until at least February 1944. So, in contrast to his experiences in Treblinka, he had a reasonable hope of survival, unlike the Jews at the nearby death camp at Birkenau. Unfortunately, he obviously committed some misdemeanor. He was sent to do some work in one of the penal work divisions, and it was there discovered that he was eventually identified as being a Jew and was sent to Mengeles barracks, fortunately just in the last week or two before evacuation from the camp, and he managed to avoid experimentation. So he was evacuated from Auschwitz in '44 and liberated from Dachau on the 29th of April 1945 after spending some time at Kaufering, a sub-camp of Dachau. When the Americans liberated the camp, he was malnourished, exhausted, and had typhus. He couldn't be easily repatriated and was moved to a DP camp near the Bavarian village of Tirschenreuth, where conditions were poor, and he faced anti-Semitic taunts from Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians, and Russians in the camp. He left there trying to get back to the family home to try and sell the building, and of course found that it was now occupied and was told he would face death if he didn't leave. Went back to Tirschenreuth, married a fellow survivor, known as Jadwiga in Poland, as Jetta in Glasgow, but he always called her Yaya all her life. She had lost her parents but had survived through a series of labour camps. And in the marriage there was very much a hierarchy of suffering. She had only been in labour camps, he had been in a death camp, and therefore his suffering was obviously greater than hers. And she was always able to heal Herschel's emotional pain when the memories of Treblinka became too intense. Herschel actually had a number of close family who were either survivors or cousins whose family had left either for Israel in the 30s or for Glasgow. And Herschel's mother's last words to him were, if you survive this, you must meet your Goldberg family in Glasgow. And one of Herschel's mother's other survivors had was an aunt who had left for South Africa in the 1930s, and when she died, she left a third of her very considerable legacy to Herschel, which obviously helped him in his efforts to create a new life. One of the things that he did was, let me just go on to this next picture, which is some of the Herschel in the middle at the back with some of the other survivors of Treblinka after the liberation. And one of the things which kept his emotional focus for some time was his communication with the other survivors who were his emotional family, and Samuel Reisman, I mentioned already, who was his surrogate family. He phoned Reisman in Montreal for very long times, despite the cost of international calls in the 1950s. They were his lifetime. He was so close to Reisman that suddenly, on the spur of the moment, he gave up his business in Glasgow, moved himself, his wife and 2 children to Montreal. He couldn't settle there, and this episode lasted just a year. Alan, the older son, came back to Glasgow to study, and the others followed a few months later. Around this time, the sons believe he made a secret trip to Treblinka to pay his respects and to say sorry to the people he couldn't save. So in Glasgow, he managed to get a bit of financial security. The cousins did help with housing and so on in the early days. But some of the early behaviour, great acceleration, taking crazy risks while he was driving. They might have not been considered crazy risks in Israeli driving, but in Scottish driving there were definitely crazy risks. Shoplifting, he was described as like living on a volcano which could have erupted at any moment. 20 years after the liberation, so we're talking about the late 60s, some of the first serious psychiatric symptoms began: depression, delusional ideas, some manic activity, and he began consulting Dr. Arthur Schenken, a consultant psychiatrist. And Schenken was somebody that I knew very, very well. He was a friend of my parents, and I knew him professionally towards the last half of his career. And Herschel went to him privately because there was still a feeling of stigmas attached to psychiatric symptoms, and he wasn't keen to go to the psychiatric hospital. In the book, there is very extensive, detailed criticism of the psychiatric treatment that Herschel experienced. The sons were very highly critical of it. It comes out very, very clearly. And this really surprised me when I first read these pages, because the milieu of psychiatry in Glasgow in the post-war period owed a lot to refugee psychiatrists who had come to the UK before, just before the war. There was Karl Abenheimer, who was a psychoanalyst, William Mayer Gross. There were many people who were around in Scottish psychiatry at the period, and it seemed strange that the treatment that he got was in the way in which was described. Sam Smith felt that his father had been misunderstood by Schenken, treating a Holocaust survivor without addressing the Holocaust. But I've seen studies in which people who have suppressed memories of Treblinka or similar experiences have recovered well when just the psychiatric symptoms have been treated. However, Herschel's constant referring to Treblinka as a nightmare and Auschwitz as and his own words, as a cakewalk, really caused difficulties within those closest to him. He was then treated with electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and this disturbed the sons, who felt that the amnesia that this caused, and he seemed to be very flat afterwards, was not the treatment for him. Disaster struck in 1977 when there was a recurrence of his wife's cervical cancer, and by this time there was secondary spread to her bones. She died in October 78, and with that, and without the person who could restore his mental compass, his manic mood swings became more extreme, more frequent, more prolonged. Now she was gone. He never worked again. He lived in a haze of alcohol, Valium and tobacco smoke, and the first of 5 unsuccessful suicide attempts began. In spite of the depth of his, one of the other things which caused him great upset was the death of Sam Reisman in Montreal, and he felt, and through the 80s, an extreme sense, disappointment, sorrow and bitterness. In early 87, however, there was a slight increase, little benefit in his mood when the American Embassy in London was looking for Treblinka survivors who might be able to identify John Ivan Demjanjuk, and who was facing trial in Israel. And 2 men from the US State Department came to Glasgow with photographs, but Herschel did not recognize the pictures that were shown to him as Ivan the Terrible, and Demjanjuk was eventually acquitted because I think this guy's crimes had been committed at a different camp. So I tried to find some records in the case notes and case files of the case conferences. In Scotland, you can't get access without family permission to the case notes of people who have died till 75 years after their death, so there was no way I could get hold of it, and so I say we had no records. So this was him at the wedding in the DP camp, and this is Samuel Reisman giving testimony at Nuremberg. Sam Reisman on the left, and this is one of the older son's childhood memories when he hears his parents talking about the camps. And you can't ask any questions, you absorb it and you get messed up. Both sons attempted suicide in the years after their father's death. Sam following reports of massacres in Kosovo, while Alan just felt that his own suffering needed to end. They both decided that they would never get married, they would never have children, and wouldn't risk doing to their children what their parents had done to them. Sam was an extraordinary thinker, a brilliant mathematician, who said he began his childhood interest in numbers, trying to work out combinations, multiplying, subtracting, dividing, manifold combinations of the numbers on his father's arm. Unfortunately, he died of cancer in his 50s. He'd lived in Israel for a little while, also in Denmark, and later becoming one of the British computer industry's most sought-after troubleshooters. The older brother just died a few weeks ago following a heart attack, and he's the one that said this parental experiences can mess you up. One of the first to recognize the psychological trauma of survivors was somebody who was actually born in Glasgow, grew up there, studied medicine there, but moved on, first of all, to England, and then became professor at Barryland University with Shammai Davidson, whose name may be familiar to many of you. Davidson felt that the majority of survivors were damaged in some basic aspects of their humanity, and even those who didn't exhibit overt psychiatric illness showed a vulnerability to breakdown in later years. And in particular, he noted that many of their manifestations of trauma and grief represented possibly normal reactions to their experience rather than psychopathology. But some of the factors that he identified as aiding successful adaptation after liberation were family networks, which which Herschel did have, understanding pre-Holocaust past, which was less so, and successful parenting, which actually never really happened. Davidson's observations that some survivors could only find the need for supportive relationships from their own group of survivors was a key factor in Herschel's life. But the sons felt that his treatment, with its emphasis on ECT, was barbaric and based on a misdiagnosis. This was his home in suburban Glasgow, but towards the end he believed that he just wanted to die. Sam felt that what drained his father of final hope, the spark that had kept him going through the camps, was when in a lucid moment he saw the film The Killing Fields, about the slaughter of millions of Cambodians under Pol Pot's communist dictatorship. He was deeply moved by it. The film showed that in his mind nothing had changed in the world. The unspeakable evil that Treblinka was for him still with him. Could his experience of Treblinka ever have been treated? His own final solution was jumping from this railway bridge, crossing the River Clyde, and that was the end. I think that's it. Thank you.